Here we go. All right. Okay. We, I believe, are almost live. We are live. All right, great. Hey, good evening, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore here in Scottsdale, Arizona. And we're here tonight with our good friend, Gregg Hurwitz. Gregg, always great to see you, albeit virtually.
Yeah, it's good to see you too. So here's a toast.
Yeah.
I'm pouring a little bit of fine vodka in honor of the book launch from Double Cross. So this is going to be our Orphan X kickoff here.
Let's see.
Here we go.
All right.
Cheers.
Cheers. Slancha. Salud.
All right.
Well,
let's talk some mayhem and fiction.
Absolutely. It's funny, before we got started, and sorry folks for starting a minute or two late here. Barbara Peters is having a little bit of tech issues, but she should be online here momentarily. It's funny, Gregg, I got some people on YouTube that are sipping various beverages as they wait. Someone's sipping a Chivas, but wishing it was Click's vodka.
All right.
Let's see here. Before we got started, you said you were kind of wished that you had picked bourbon or Evan.
Well, I get a lot of great vodkas because if I write about vodka in the books,
yeah,
sales tend to go up. So I get a lot of wonderful personalized bottles from distillers, and I do love vodka a lot. But you know, bourbon is sort of in my bone marrow, and so if I was writing about me, less my character, because vodka is more suited to Orphan X.
Yeah,
it's a bit of a purification rite. It's the purest of all the liquids, and the process of distillation, in some regards, mirrors his process of training and the orientation towards perfection that he was brought up under. So vodka mirrors that as the purest spirit. So it's very much suited to him.
Sure, absolutely. Let's see. Here comes Barbara. Let's hope she has a good connection. Here she is.
Hello, Barbara.
Sorry about that. The Windows decided to suddenly update this laptop right in the middle of whatever we were doing. I have no idea why.
Oh.
Anyway, it's great to see you, Gregg. Patrick, you've already introduced Dark Horse?
Haven't even gotten that far.
Okay.
Yeah, this is Dark Horse, Gregg's brand new Orphan X novel. And Gregg very kindly signed a nice batch of books for us. So everybody watching, I'll put a link in the comments field should you wish to purchase one. And if you have questions for Gregg, go ahead and put them in, and Barbara will call me back at some point in the hour, and I'll be happy to ask any question you might have for Gregg. So I will see you in a bit.
Thank you, Patrick. And if I disappear again, Patrick will
come back
and I will disappear. So it's kind of like, you know, I don't know what, Jack in the Box, we leap in and out. Anyway, Gregg, it's wonderful to see you. This has been such an exciting series. I don't know if I told you that for many years at the Poison Pen, and especially when we were over in the art district when people were or I need a great thriller. And for years and years, we sold them The Charm School by Nelson DeMille. We kept like 10 of them, you know, it was always a winner. And recently, well, that's not true, maybe 4 years ago, we decided that Orphan X was going to become our go-to airplane, sell me a great thriller book. And so we always have multiple copies in stock, and that's what we do. And it's been absolutely great.
I love that. Thank you. That's quite an honor. That's good company to be in.
Well, it is good company to be in, but I mean, you know, let's be real. The Charm School is somewhat dated by now, although it's hard to beat Nelson DeMille, you know, for craft and all the rest of it. But I think Orphan X is it's a wonderful book to get people started on a series or just to give them a single great read. You know, you've written so many different books before you came into the Orphan X series. Do you feel like, you know, you were preparing for it all that time, or did you just have some sort of great brainstorm that decided that you would suddenly focus on this new character?
Quite literally. I had the idea for Orphan X maybe 5 books before I wrote it. And I had the idea for a series. There's a lot of things about it. There's a lot of ways that stories come in. They can either reach him on his 1-855 to nowhere line, which anybody can call and he'll answer. There's stories that come in from the Orphan Program, the Assassins program that he was raised in. There's stories he stumbles upon. There's the neighbors he lives among. And so I needed to have a world where stories could come from all different sides and perspectives. I didn't want it to just be that it's his job. I think that came from writing standalone novels. I wrote 7 of them, like kind of Hitchcock thrillers leading up to it. But I had the idea for this, and there's so many series that I admire so much. I mean, whether it's Bond or Bourne or Reacher or Ari Bosch or Elvis Cole. I mean, you just go down the list, the Irish Horse. And I just felt like I wanted to wait until I really had a handle on what would differentiate this, that it would have a very different feel, that it wouldn't feel like it's something that was a ripoff. And I had a notion of this character, but there was a couple key realizations that I had to come to in order to feel like it was a space that I could live in year after year after year. One of them was the fact that these stories can come in from all sorts of different angles. And I really like that, where the question of motive, why he gets involved on a particular mission, is somewhat up for grabs. It's not always just that it's his job to do it. And the other was, he's taken out of a foster home at the age of 12. He's trained up to be an assassin. And there's this line for me around which the whole series coalesces. And it's when Jack, his father figure and handler, tells him when he's 12 years old, the hard part isn't turning you into a killer. The hard part is keeping you human. And I thought, what if him being taken into this program isn't just horrible and traumatic, as is often the case within this trope? What if it's also the best thing that ever happened to him? What if his handler was the first person to treat him like a human? And Jack, in some regards, turns him into, he shows him the world. I mean, he's this broke kid from a Baltimore foster home. And Jack really turns him into a blue-collar Renaissance man. He travels the world. He shows him care. He treats him like a human. But he also trains him to do horrible things. And so that complexity and that notion of wanting to maintain his humanity was one of the core elements. And the other was, I made a decision that he would live among ordinary people. So unlike Reacher, one of my favorite characters in the world, who tends to move through an archetypal Western landscape, Evan goes home, and his home is surrounded with people who are ordinary people with ordinary concerns. And he might be out in a knife fight or a sniper shootout and have to come home and figure out how to deal with the aggravation of sitting in an HOA meeting where they're debating what the new carpet pile should be in the lobby. And so this choice to move him between the worlds and to catch him at this moment of constantly becoming and trying to figure out, as I call it, the strange language of intimacy. He's trying to kind of crack out of his upbringing to a different kind of understanding of what it means to be human, was the template. And I think once I had those elements, I thought, this is a series that I can really write and spend the majority of my waking hours on, right? I spend more time in these books than I do, more waking hours than with my family or with anyone else. And I thought I'd have a lot to say around it and a lot to move. And I felt like it could be distinguished enough to, I hope, one day earn a place in that pantheon of great series characters.
I thought this marvel. In the first place, this is Gregg's virtual book lunch. So let's raise a glass. And Gregg, you want to show off your amazing Orphan X bottle there? Because it's just so incredibly cool.
Well, this is a double cross is what I'm drinking, which is a wonderful, wonderful vodka. It's one of Evan's, and they sent it to me with a little bit of a personalized edge on it. So I have some great vodkas here with different notes from different distillers. A lot of them thanking Evan for choosing to drink them. So it's a good perk. It's a good perk of the business.
You know, Peter Robinson told me years ago that he was traveling in Australia, and I'm trying to remember whether he sent Inspector, he must have sent thanks to Australia for some purpose. Anyway, he visited some distillery in Australia, after which they kept sending him, wonderful wine or Scott, whatever it was from Australia. And I thought, there is a perk for sending books in or drinking things or whatever it may be. But let's go back to X, because your point about him living in the real world among ordinary people is a really interesting one. I mean, with Reacher, whom I'm planning to watch the first one when we're through tonight, because I didn't get a chance this weekend, when Reacher gets off the bus, he's in a strange place. And when he's all done, he gets on the bus and he goes away and there's no afterburner. But, the Superman question was always, if people knew he was Superman, I guess it's the Spider-Man issue too, then the people around him could be in danger. And so how is it that you want X to live in an ordinary, well, in his case, an extraordinary apartment, but we'll get to that, but in an ordinary, let's say, residence in Los Angeles with neighbors and an HOA, and yet not endanger them because eventually his location will become known.
Well, he's got to be ready at a moment's notice to leave it all behind. And so as much as he's anchored there, he's not of the place. He has to know, and look, there's some question. He's had an ongoing don't ask, don't tell flirtation with Mia Hall, the woman, single mother, lives downstairs. She's a district attorney. If she ever really knew what he did, she'd have to arrest him. She's aware that he's more, he claims to be an importer of industrial cleaning supplies, which is a nice little metaphor for what he does. But she knows there's a bit more to it, and they kind of have to dance around the issue. And so he can never be fully known. And if he ever is discovered, he has to be prepared to walk away from everything. And so he's, I picture Evan a lot as having his face up to the glass, and he can never live among ordinary people based on him being raised in the Orphan Program, based on the fact that the US government, he has the information in his head is still too valuable for it to remain attached to his body as far as the DOD is concerned. So he's constantly going to be a target. And he's got his face up to the glass, and he can never live an ordinary life like so many of the people who he's around. But at least what he can do is help people who are being pursued by, he's like a wolf who's sent out to protect against other wolves. And he can at least help them to reestablish the ordinary lives that they can live, even if he can never be part of it. So it's always this question of being an outsider. And, he's been learning very slowly and opening up very slowly to understanding more about human interaction and what that means, and to understand the nuance that comes from that, because he was raised under the very strict 10 Assassin's Commandments handed down to him from Jack. And they're very rigid, they're very perfection based, but humans and relationships can't be based around perfection. People are messy.
So, for those of you who read the series, and I will say that each of the books does stand alone, so it's not impossible for you as a new reader to buy Dark Horse and plunge in. Nonetheless, every book builds on every other book in certain ways, including relationships. So at one point, X, a book or two back, I think it was a book or two back anyway, discovers who his mother is, which was something that, was a complete surprise to him. And that maybe he has more family than he thought he had. And at the end of the last book, it's not a spoiler to say that Evan survived having his apartment blown up, because here we are with a new book. So to that degree, it's a spoiler. He could have chosen to move somewhere else rather than to rehab his seemingly impregnable residence. So why did you decide to keep him in the building instead of moving him on? I think that was an interesting question. When I opened the book, I was a little surprised to discover that he was rehabbing instead of looking for new accommodation.
He is committed as much as he can and to maintaining his own safety and the safety of those around him, but he's committed to trying to figure out how to interpret human relationships differently. And so moving on is just a constant process of moving on, right? He's been largely on the move for most of his life. But as much as people aggravate, annoy, and irritate him, there's something more to it too in some of these relationships. His relationship with Mia downstairs, his relationship with Peter, who's her boy, who reminds Evan in some ways of like a healthier version of who Evan was, right? Because Evan grew up in this East Baltimore foster home. And so, it's really interesting. I've been thinking a lot about where I started the series. And a lot of what happens only makes sense when you look back at it. But if you think about how the story would be told chronologically, Evan's a 12-year-old boy in a foster home. He's taken out by Jack. He's trained to be an assassin. He does his first assassination in the Orphan Program around the age of 18. Then he's Orphan X. Then his moral compass, which was never broken, and Jack never turned him into a true believer, which is sort of his Achilles heel, right? If he was a true believer, it would have been easier for him to just be an assassin forever. But his moral compass eventually collides with what the program asks him to do. He goes on the run, he reestablishes himself, he becomes the nowhere man, where he is essentially a pro bono assassin who helps the truly desperate who have nowhere to turn. They call him at the 1-855 to nowhere program phone number. And then he commits a bunch of missions for those people. And when I start the first book in the series, it's when the phone rings and it's the first mission that will bring his past back to him and will explode his worldview, will explode his sense of comfort, his sense of safety, that will make him break every single one of the 10 commandments. And it's a really weird starting point that I never really considered. I never thought about, and then bits and pieces of this now have been filled in over the last 6 books. Prodigal Son was the 6th book that finally we go back and see him in the foster home more fully. But it's interesting because I chose the moment for him where it is the process of becoming, in some ways, the moment where he realized that his whole old worldview would no longer hold, that the old commandments no longer suffice, that his whole world was sort of exploding around him, and he had to figure out how to burrow towards a different understanding of himself and people and human relationships. And I didn't even think about it consciously when I started to write the story. I never thought about picking it up there, but I'm really picking it up at the point where he is starting to move towards wanting to have a different understanding of what it means to be a human and to be in human relationships, and to welcome in all the mess and complications and frustration that comes with that without having these neat strictures around him. And so in a lot of ways, that is why he chose to remain there. I think if it had happened at any time previous to where I started, he would have just moved on, as he always has. But that's not what the series is about. The series is about him making unpredictable choices that run counter to much of his training.
That's an excellent point. But I anytime somebody crafts a character who in theory is going to be a complete loner. I mean, we know about Reacher, and that design is pretty much bulletproof. But, we can look at John Rain, for example, started out and, he wanted no human ties, no human commitments, the whole bit. But you can't actually, with the exception probably of Reacher, it's very difficult to write a series where other people don't somehow come into and get attached or get affected or whatever. And that eventually, I think, made it difficult to write the Rain Man series. And then I was thinking, because Thomas Perry wrote a new Jane Whitefield? Which is it? Do you remember? I'm going blank. Well, anyway, Jane. And it came out in November. And Jane, who has done like the Nowhere Man, people call her and she helps them escape from whatever terrible situation there is. She doesn't charge them for it. And in the end, they're supposed to pay it forward by giving her number to somebody else. But by now she's acquired a husband. There's some thought of, maybe they'd like to have a child and all. And so she has to operate differently. And, it was an interesting book. Patrick will Patrick says it's Whitefield, but I like Jane Mansfield better. Thank you. Patrick is the voice from out here that helps me remember things, which is wonderful.
Patrick's the memory.
Yes, it's very helpful. But my point is that, Jane, to some degree, is like the Nowhere Man, but with a completely different backstory. But her object is to help people, and her recompense is, the people that she helps are supposed to pay it forward. And I'm not sure if Tom can ever write another one. I'm not going to spoil the left-handed guy that was the title, but he may have written it to the point where she can't, this is her retirement book. She can't really continue to do that, but she's a female, which has some biological, whatever, attached implications attached to it. But Evan, in theory, could go on as long as Evan, can, and if a relationship breaks down, he can move on. But he's gotten attached not just to the woman and her little son, Peter, but there are a couple of very nice scenes in this book where he's being helpful to, or trying to find the other tenants in the building, the HOA people, less I don't want to say intrusive, annoying. What would you call it?
Intrusive and annoying.
Okay. But he's kind of smoothing down his edges, and
basically it's a process of him starting to see through people as these caricatures that they put forth, and literally starting to see through, instead of just reading them as obstacles or strategic impediments, he's starting to see through them to some humanity that underlies it, to some human vulnerability. He's starting to kind of evolve a different understanding of empathy and understanding for people. So it's almost like he's thawing out of just viewing everybody in some ways as strategic impediments, and starting to understand them better. And it doesn't, it takes slowing down and paying attention. He's very good at doing both, but he tends to do it towards a strategic aim. And so he's starting to realize, I think, in some ways also, that the rules, the kind of tactical skills, his operational skills he's been raised with, can also have emotional applications, in terms of understanding people and figuring out what it is that they need and comprehend. Because he's like an alien who was raised outside of all this. So he doesn't understand the urges that people are expressing, the sort of insecurities and vulnerabilities that they express are very different than the stuff that he grapples with. But he's trying to kind of figure out a way through to more common ground with them and see them as more three-dimensional. So it's been really fun, in a series where some of the characters who have been somewhat more stereotypical, whether it's Ida Rosenbaum, like the aggravating elderly Jewish woman who lives downstairs from him, or Hugh Walters, who's the imperious HOA president, that he starts to have these moments that these characters who are three-dimensional to the readers and to him all of a sudden start to have a bit more hidden depth, right? They're catching different kinds of shadows. There's different textures to them. And once they're three-dimensionalized, they live in the world differently, which means he lives in the world differently. And this is part of what these missions, these pro bono missions have taught him. It's part of what his partnership with Joey Morales, who's his, the 16-year-old brilliant hacker, who he got saddled with some books back in Hellbent, in the third book in the series. But he's developed a kind of care for her. And in some ways, he's the closest to her of anyone, even closer to her than he is with Mia and Peter, because she's a washout from the Orphan Program, and she kind of was his charge. So they've established this rapport where he really cares for her and sees her in a different light. And she's opened up a lot of who he is also. And then there's these times where she'll still catch really rough edges from him and vice versa. There's times where he really locks down to go back on mission. That there's this, he sort of blots out the parts of humanity and all the nuance and texture that are required when he has to get operational and go into a mission.
Well, so as an orphan, I mean, he's kind of in the process of a found family, finding one, although not fully committing to it, which I find really interesting. Before we get into this story, which has some really interesting ethical I think dimensions for Evan. How are you in construction? Because, you obviously have really thought seriously about the entire construction of Evan's penthouse, and now you're rehabbing it. So what do you know about construction that makes it possible for you? I mean, I know about your medical background and other stuff, but it never has occurred to me that you actually knew anything about construction. But you have recently moved to a new house, if I remember this right. Did you build it? Did you learn on the job?
Not much. That is not one of my strong suits. A lot of things in the books are not my strong suits. One of the things when Jack trains Evan, he says your job is to learn a little bit about everything from people who know everything about one thing. And so with construction, part of that was there's always a risk in a series, particularly in a thriller series, of losing the reader as I'm trying to carry them across the suspension of disbelief. And one of them is Evan has this unbelievable penthouse. It's like a Scandinavian treehouse. It hovers up above. It's on the 21st floor, the age of maturity, on the 21st floor of a high-rise residential condo apartment building in the Wilshire corridor near Beverly Hills. Open floor plan, ballistic glass windows. There's discrete armor shades. There's all sorts of, there's workout stations. Everything is sleek and clean and suits his OCD nature. It's all poured concrete and stainless steel fixtures. His bed is a maglev bed that floats above the ground. It's repelled by magnets and tethered to the floor with cables. He has a hidden vault through a secret door that is his sort of nerve center of his operations. And part of it is there's a risk that I could lose this into a sort of fantasy land. And so one of the things that happened at the end of Prodigal Son, Evan's apartment is destroyed. And so what I want to do always is really think through all of the details so that I can make them real. Like, how do I really bring verisimilitude to this story? And so we never saw him build it the first time around, but this time around, he has to figure out how to put this back together. How do you do that in the middle of an apartment building that's filled with other people and residents who would notice when you're installing stuff that is highly ballistic or tactical? And what are the ways he would have to smuggle materials in? How would he have them built? How could he have them installed? What measures would he have to take? What things would have to be brought in? And so if I can make that process real and really think through even the somewhat what would be tedious logistics under other circumstances, but I can make them pop with all the focus on detail. And if I can make the building of that feel real, then I get to anchor the reader and myself and him in this world that he's built that's of his own making in a way that's a lot more real than if I was writing a comic book. And it just is.
So is this apartment sort of a fantasy for you? I mean, I couldn't help but wonder if you, Gregg, would like to have actually lived in this apartment.
It's pretty great. I mean, it is. It's a version. It's sort of this airtight version where everything is aligned to his liking. Everything is in its place. He's got more than a touch of OCD.
Right.
I contrast it constantly with Mia's apartment, which is downstairs, where she's got like crayon mash in the carpet. There's always laundry. She's cooking. There's smells. There's life to it and color. And so it's a fantasy, but in some ways it's an immature fantasy, right? It's like it's a boy or younger man's fantasy. It doesn't embody all of the life and color and flavor of living among people and as a person. It's sterile and cold. I mean, the only objects in there that are alive is he's got a living wall, a vertical garden that he grows, accoutrements often for his high-end vodka. He's got a vodka room, like a freezer room that stores his world-class vodka, not unlike some of this collection. And he's got Vera, who is a aloe vera plant who he has to water basically once a week with a large spherical ice cube, not unlike that one. And he still can't manage. I mean, we're on Vera 3 at this point because he's killed the first 2 Veras because he can't even really keep any care of her. And so it is a fantasy, but like all fantasies, it's two-dimensional. And it's contrasted often with the fullness and richness and complexity that comes with the mess and interaction of other people. So he's in these situations where when he's engaging in all the dirtiness of the missions, he's also, and he feels almost contaminated by it. But he also feels a contamination around intimacy that's hard for him.
Well, there's a contrast between a residence and a home, but I have to say part of the dynamic of reading Dark Horse is hoping that Evan's actually going to succeed in his construction project, because it's not entirely clear that it's going to be that easy. So
and leaves Joey in charge of it. Well, and he leaves Joey in charge of part of it, which is a recipe for disaster.
Joey has an interesting story in this book too, which we won't go into, but I like the fact that, you give her some interesting stuff to do in this book. She's a really great character. And, it used to be in so many novels where there was an action hero that there would be some sort of backup, whether it was Hawk or whether it was, and it's almost impossible now for a really serious action hero not to have some sort of IT backup, and Joey is a really good pairing with Evan, I think, and an interesting character. You've always got the potential for giving her a really big role in one of the books. If you, were to sideline Evan with, taking out a knee or something, Joey could actually assume it would be kind
That's
of
right.
interesting.
She's ready. She's
Yeah,
ready.
no, she definitely is. So one of the other things you have to deal with in writing these books is, where's the mission come from? I mean, out of an infinite number of potential missions that you could start out with, and only you can in fact choose them, there has to be some reason why Evan embarks on this particular one. There's one where his mother summons him, but in this one, tell us about what the mission is and what is the ethical dilemma that Evan is going to face if he accepts it.
Well, this one's very unusual. He gets a phone call through a series of connections that are not the normal ones from somebody who calls Evan. Every time he answers the phone, when somebody calls the 1-855 to nowhere number, he says, "Do you need my help? Where did you get this number?" He always sources it. And the person who needs his help describes himself as an unconventional businessman. He goes by his name is Aragon Urrea, and he's basically cartel 2.0. He's a cartel dealer, but he's Netflix to Blockbuster, right? He skirts the edges of international law. He brings in drugs through channels. He does everything sort of virtually. He doesn't have a huge infrastructure. And he also is sort of a beloved patron in his community in South Texas, where he lives. He's Mexican, now Mexican-American, and he, provides uniforms for the school and patches the roofs and gives equipment to the farmers. And so you go into this town and it's like an idol in some ways, because he's given so much of his money to his community. And a lot of questions are raised later in the book by him and by the woman who raised him, Latia, his aunt, where she sort of compares what he does to the big biopharmaceutical companies, right, who made hundreds of billions of dollars off opioids. And her argument is, he's just as capitalistic. He's playing by the same rules. The only difference is he actually gives more back to the community. But he's ambiguous. He dispenses his own brand of rough justice, just as Evan does himself. And so the phone rings, and this guy basically needs his help, and yet he's a cartel member. So he's normally somebody who Evan would target and kill. But the mission that he wants help for is a mission that Evan determines is pure, which is that his 18-year-old daughter, Angelina, who he loves, who is the light of his life, was kidnapped by an absolutely brutal psychopathic cartel leader and spirited across the border to Mexico, where she's being held captive in a cartel compound. And so Evan has to ask himself this question, which is, does he help a man who's way more shadowed than anyone else who he's encountered and tried to help? Can you help somebody who has equal parts evil that he does good, not unlike Evan himself? And so there's a central question here, which is, can you save a bad man? And that's a question Evan has been asking himself of himself ever since he left the Orphan Program. And so Aragon Urrea, in a lot of ways, is this mirror of himself. It's a whole different level of embodied power in the person he's sort of an antagonist, but he's also Evan's client, and he's somebody who Evan would murder and target and neutralize under different circumstances, but he's kind of working with and coming to know and understand this man. It's a very unique dynamic. For a lot of years, I've thought about, what would someone be like who Orphan X would be friends with? We have Tommy Stojak. Tommy's been Evan's armorer and his friend. They have a bit of a shared history. And there's a lot of similarity in the fact that they're both rowing in the same direction. But there's not a ton of actual intimacy within that relationship with him and Tommy. It's all kind of at brusque arm's length. And Aragon Urrea presents to Evan either the ultimate threat or in some ways the ultimate opportunity, which is to have a different conversation with somebody who might understand parts of Evan and see parts of Evan that he hasn't even allowed himself to think about and look at in himself. And so this mission is very treacherous ground, not only for the mission itself. Can Evan go south, go to Mexico, try to infiltrate this gang that is this cartel that's beyond horrifying in what they do, and this young woman who is in an unbelievably threatened position, but he's also engaging with this dance with the devil, so to speak, with Aragon, who presents all these reflections and twisted distortions of himself.
Well, I agree that Aragon is the client, and that is the problem. But in fact, it's not Aragon who's kidnapped and being held prisoner in Mexico. It's his daughter, who, is and by all accounts quite lovely. You have a scene where we get to see her. So I think part of the problem for Evan is he has to, divorce the father from the daughter and recognize that saving the daughter, while it is different than if he were saving the man. I also enjoyed your bit in the afterword where you gave a little thanks to Luis Alberto Urrea. Did you borrow his name on purpose for this?
Yes. So Luis Urrea is one of our great writers. He was Pulitzer nominated for Devil's Highway. I was introduced to him by T. Jefferson Parker. And Luis is a big thriller fan. He'd read my work. I familiarized myself with his. I mean, his stuff is spectacular. Devil's Highway is so good, you can't almost believe how good it is. He's so talented. He's just unbelievable. And I had the benefit of having one of our maybe our greatest Mexican-American writer and friend of mine offering me kind of input, guidance. I would text him and say, what's the best slang for this? What's the best thing? I grew up in California and live in California, so I have a lot of affection and for the Mexican-American community is part of my family and friends and community. It has been from day one. But to have a writer of his caliber and of his sort of wisdom and that kind of cultural depth he was so generous and just made himself available to me, gave me guidance, pointed me to resources, made sure I was using the right slang that wasn't outdated. It was just spectacular. And so I gave him, he was one of those instant and great friendships that you have that it just feels immediate. And in some ways I wanted that to be the name of somebody that Evan felt the same way towards in certain ways, eventually. Or not, or maybe they don't get along and try and kill each other. We're not sure which way it's going to go.
Well, we have an interesting connection with him. Patrick, you should pop in here. I could tell the story, but it probably would come better for you. Are you there? Not sure he's there. There he is. You should tell, at this moment, since we've digressed anyway, tell Gregg about your own connection with Luis, because it's a wonderful one.
Well, it's funny. I was going to ask you about the name. Yeah, no, I share your enthusiasm for his work. I think he's a terrific writer. And I remember reading him those early books he wrote about, the nonfiction books about the border, by the lake, Across the Wire, and By the Lake of Sleeping Children. Just a great writer. And when I was putting together anthology Phoenix Noir for Akashic Books, I kind of put together a dream list of people I'd like to get. And I was friendly with Luis. I didn't know him too well, but I reached out to him and I said, hey, can you write something? And he goes, I don't write mystery and crime stuff. And I said, well, can you try? Do it anyway, And he goes, sure, yeah, I'll give it a shot. And yeah, and it was really gratifying because his story in that anthology won the Edgar Award, which I think surprised the hell out of him and everybody. And it was just just a real neat experience.
It was wonderful. I tried, I don't know if I've ever actually told Patrick this, but when Luis's story was announced as one of the Edgar candidates, one of the people on the committee who will remain nameless wrote to me and he said, are you going to send Patrick to the Edgars? So I knew that Luis had won. And I tried to get Patrick to go. I offered to pay his way, but I couldn't tell him because it's a secret. I couldn't tell him why I wanted him to go. And Patrick declined. So I went and I was sitting, it was a stellar list. And I was sitting at this table and right next to me at this table was a HarperCollins table with Dennis Lehane. So he was also nominated for the Edgar for the short story. And, when it came up in whoever the author was who was going to give away the Edgars, started in, and I could feel Dennis, who was reasonably sure that he had won it, kind of tense himself to rise. And I wanted to reach over and say, don't move. But then I thought, no, I can't really do that. So I sat there and I was probably the only person in the room besides, well, Luis, they must have told him, Patrick, because I don't know that he would have gone. Yeah, he must have gone. He was there.
That's a hell of a short list. I'll say, Dennis is another really big personal inspiration for me.
Lovely guy. Yeah.
Before I went back, one of my breakout books, I've had a couple, as opposed to some people really had one that was pronounced, but let's call it one book that really leveled up my career was The Crime Writer. And I had seen Dennis speak about Chircon, about Mystic River, and writing it and risk taking, and the way that he writes with such unbelievable nuance. Like he never writes villains and heroes. It's always shades of gray and complexity. And I went home and I literally sat down in one reading and I read all of Mystic River again. I don't think I've told him this story. And I put it back on the shelf and I sat down to write The Crime Writer. It was just, I wanted to touch base with that. So there's writers who are certainly of that caliber, and Luis Urrea is one of them. He says he doesn't write crime fiction, but of course he does.
And he won an Edgar for it, which I think is
good for him. But yeah, he was a big part of this, and it was a great excuse to be in touch with him too, through the course of writing the book. So that was a great part of it, and it was a wonderful way to make sure I was getting, as much about the culture right as I could. Obviously, it's a culture I'm very fond of and familiar with, but it was important to make sure I was, on the edge of that, making sure that I was paying it appropriate respect. And, there's a lot of complexity. I'm writing a lot of characters who are good and bad and in between, which is, I think, in some ways the best way that you show respect to different cultures, is you give them the full coloring that you can.
So Evan takes this assignment, obviously, or we wouldn't even be having this discussion. And he goes after, is it Angelina or Angelina? I thought it would be Angelina.
Yeah.
Anyway, so he agrees to see what he can do to head into Mexico and rescue her. And at this point,
dash vodka now. I'm just letting you know.
There, right? At this point, we can't really tell you any more about the book without spoiling it. But I will say that another truly famous author will come to mind as you read this book towards the end. I'm not even going to tell you who, but Gregg is always very good at surprising turns and twists in his stories. So it's a very captivating book. Why did you call it Dark Horse?
Well, that's a nickname that Evan is given by El Moreno, who's the opposing cartel member. And there's something about it that I also think I like titles that are ambiguous yet specific. So Evan's the Dark Horse, but in some ways Aragon Urrea is, right? He's another very principal character in the story. He's a Dark Horse. It's the unexpected, right? You're betting on the horse that isn't the likely one to win, but somehow coming there. And there's the shading of it. It sounds beautiful in Spanish, and it has multiple applications in the book. And so I always like something like that. I like to kind of pin things down that way. So it had the ring, and it's one of the few titles I arrived out with relative ease. It's hard for me to title books.
Is there a Spanish language edition yet?
No, not yet. Not yet.
Bio Oscuro, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's what he's called through the book. So.
Well, we can't say any more about the story. So maybe we should take questions from the audience, and then no doubt other things will occur to us. Patrick, do we have any comments or questions?
We do. Let's see here. Crystal asks, what was your favorite standalone novel of yours before you wrote Orphan X?
Oh, it's so hard. It's like kids asking, which crayon drawing is better. Certain ones have different resonance for me. The Crime Writer is very autobiographical in a lot of ways. That has a lot of meaning to me. And I would say for fans of Orphan X, the two that are the closest that spring to mind are probably You're Next and The Survivor. The Survivor's got a very special place in my heart.
Let's see here. Okay, the invariable question. If Orphan X was made into a movie, who would you like to play Evan?
I don't know. I sold it and adapted it originally for Bradley Cooper. And he moved on to A Star Is Born, which he wrote, directed, starred in, and produced. And so the option wasn't re-up, but he was my first choice. He was the only person that I sent the manuscript to ahead of publication, and Warner Brothers bought it and I adapted it for him because he has that wonderful range of the humanity from Silver Linings Playbook all the way through the sort of intensity of American Sniper. I don't know. I honestly, it's what's weird is I adapted it some for TV. I was playing with that. I had different attachments come in. I had on the feature side, I had Will Smith attached for like 2 days. Like there's been all these iterations. And one of the things that I've realized is I was doing a lot of the adaptation. I worked on it for TV and I realized that the books had progressed far enough that I couldn't go back and adapt it myself. I've adapted my own work. I've adapted other people's work on the screenplay side, but the books had evolved to such a point that the notion of starting to go back and reimagine the genesis of a universe to run parallel, I'm too far away from it. And so in some ways it was a humbling experience to arrive at the realization that I no longer want to take point on it creatively. And so I'm sort of sitting back and I've kind of pulled it back from the market. We've had some inquiries about it, but what I realized is I want somebody to come in who shows interest, who is a creative force, first of all, but somebody who's already a fan of the book. I don't want to go out and try to sell the book to people for them to understand what it is. It has to be somebody who knows it, understands it, and has kind of dealt with it in a way that they have a very firm creative take and can drive it. And then I could be helpful, in a supportive capacity. And so I don't know who that is. I'm waiting for it to be seen. In my head, there's a version of him that has always existed above and beyond any actor or any depiction, as there is with all the characters. And people at different times there's been a kind of Venn diagram overlap. And at one time that overlap looked the most like Bradley Cooper if I was dealing with it in the real world. But I don't even have the answer anymore.
Because you live in Southern California now, is there more pressure to have your books adapted into either film or streaming television, do you think, than if you were an author living in, let's say, Baltimore or Charleston or something?
I don't think so. I mean, Lee Child has never lived here and has certainly been at the center of much discussion around production and casting. Mike, of course, Mike Connolly is of LA in a huge way. So he's not the best example, but I think no matter where you are, I mean, George R.R. Martin doesn't live here. I think the bigger point is that, I do work in screenplays. I had a movie come out last year starring Jason Momoa called Sweet Girl that I co-wrote with Phil Eisner. And so I do have projects that I'm working in, and it's good to live in LA for that. Because an idea will come into me, and sometimes it's a screenplay, sometimes it's a pilot, sometimes it's a comic. And with the books are always my first love. They've been the spine of my career, and that's always where I live. And they always have to exist as novels first and foremost. I can't write a novel with an eye towards adaptation. They're different animals. They function differently. And so it's always about writing that. And then if I ever get to adaptation, I have to take the novelist hat off and put on the screenwriter hat. And it's occupying a different space creatively.
When you say that, Greg, for people, because people are always interested in that question, how is it compellingly different to write a novel than it is a screenplay?
There's so much less room in screenplays. I mean, a novel, you have 400 pages of final product, right? I'm the director, I'm all the actors, I'm the writer, I'm hair and makeup, I'm the location scout, right? I'm props. You have to do all of it. And screenplays are 110 pages with a lot of white on the page. It's a recipe for a product, right? It's an invitation to collaborate. And you can't overly direct, right? Because that's very amateurish if you put in all the stage directions and then, your director comes along and pats you on the head and says, thanks very much, but this is what I do for a living. So you have to insinuate, like there's all sorts of ways that you have to evoke the beauty and the tone and the movement. And so it's quite different in those regards. And, of course, you have to choose your partners well, because at the end of the day, you have to pick people where it will become a positive feedback loop of collaboration, where everybody doing their part makes it better. Because if it's not that, it's getting worse. And if it gets worse, it's awful. And then, you're the drunk guy out behind the bar with a broken bottle, like trying to protect the script, which means you've done everything wrong.
I've always thought it would be really difficult for a novelist to adapt his work to a screenplay or her work, but I don't know enough about it, to know if that's any kind of a sound judgment. I was always interested that Chandler didn't, who was it that wrote the screenplay for The Big Sleep? It wasn't Chandler. It was somebody else, that.
Faulkner.
Sorry?
Faulkner.
Okay. We tend to think that the author did the screenplay, but generally that's really not the case. Lee did an interview in the New York Times. I don't know if you read it. I think it was either Saturday. No, it must have been Friday in the arts section because the TV, show premiered Friday night. And he had some really good answers to questions about being involved in all the. Did you happen to read it?
I'm going to make a note right now to read it. I'd love to see that. I somehow missed it. It was in the New York Times, you said?
It was the New York Times, and it was in the arts section. I'm sure it was Friday because it was going to premiere that night, although I can double check. But he had some very realistic answers to the questions. And one of the things he said was, that he'd been in television for 30 years. So he knew how things worked. And he's very much hands off, in watching this, because he recognizes that the books will be a different animal. And I know Diana went off to Scotland to write one of the episodes for Outlander when in the first, was it the first season, Patrick? Do you remember?
I think so. Yeah, I think so.
Right. And I remember when she came back and we had lunch and she was saying to me that she had a scene somewhere, in the castle. And when they went to film it, the configuration of the castle doesn't allow the scene to work. So they had to change it. They couldn't knock down the castle and rebuild it in order to make this thing work. And, it was an expression for her that no screenplay can, or no movie, that whatever can ever be a completely faithful adaptation of a novel for various reasons, including just the physicality of it.
And nor do you want that. My first movie was called The Book of Henry, and it starred, among other people, Naomi Watts. And I did that screenplay first when I was 21 years old. It took me 19 years to get that made. And there's this one speech that I'd written, and rewritten. I kept rewriting and revisiting the script over the years and adding to it and subtracting from it. But there was this one speech I had, and on the day that we were shooting it, Naomi Watts came out, she did the whole speech, and then there was this moment that she just pauses, and this universe of emotion washed across her face. It was just like one sentiment after another, and she told the whole story. It's one of the most remarkable things I've ever seen. And I remember I was in Video Village watching it, and I thought, there's no way that speech that was written is going to survive now, because she just said it all without saying it. And part of that is the point of film, is that if you can say something without needing the words to it, it's a visual medium. And it was this really interesting moment that I felt letting go. It's taken me a while. Lee worked in TV for a lot of years to kind of keep catching up to that notion, is that when things are going well, and when you're up against real no shit talent like Naomi Watts, you want to let go of control. And it was this marvelous realization of she never could have got into the space to have that moment if it wasn't for the script and all the writing. But now she's just done something with it, made it her own, and sort of transformed it. And that scene won't survive as written, nor should it, right? The scene was to get her there into that moment, to give her own depiction of what that beat was in the story. And if the way she conveyed it was so much more emotional, and the words weren't necessary anymore. And so that's something that's quite different in the filming process.
I thought you said a really good thing a little while ago, where you said, it's an invitation to collaborate, to write a screenplay. I'd never really thought about that quite that way, but that seems to me to be very true. And I will also say that, Marshall McLuhan made a great impact on me many years ago when I read him, when he pointed out that reading a book is a solipsist experience. In other words, it's just you and the book. Well, you could be reading it aloud to somebody else, but basically it's you in the book. But watching, a film, movie, television, same thing, is a collegial experience. And, it's a different experience. And so you take in the story differently than you do when it's just you in the book. And of course, he was really writing in an era when people went to the movies. And so it was a much more collective kind of a viewing thing. Now, today with streaming, people can be sitting home having the same solipsist experience watching something that's not what McLuhan was used to or was writing about. But I do think that as an effect, also the way we process the story has a lot to do with whether we're reading it or whether we're viewing it or whether we're viewing it with other people.
Yeah. And there's a real intimacy to books. I think like there's a relationship between author and reader that's very special because, if when I'm writing well, I'm not painting all the details, right? It's not about making the violence as graphic and explained as possible, nor the emotional scenes. It's writing indicators that sort of point to sentiment or point to horror or point to suspense or point to poignancy. And every reader who reads it fills that in with themselves, right? They fill that in with their own experiences, their own vulnerabilities and triumphs and fears and anxieties and hopes. And so it's very intimate because if I sell 1 million copies of a book, there's 1 million different versions that are playing in 1 million readers' minds, and each one is individualized. And so writing takes that into account, right? If we're overwriting, we're not trusting the reader to get enough cues that we're sort of intimating something, we're pointing them to something. And the more that we can do that and have them put it together themselves, the more the process is internal to them, right? And the more personal that it feels to them.
Patrick, sorry, we digressed as we always do. Any other questions? Or do you want to comment on all that?
Well, there's a question, somebody's asking about Nowhere, the title Nowhere Man, and were you inspired by the Beatles song to get that?
It's funny because that's the most obvious answer. And of course that occurred to me. But part of it is there's this sort of Zen aspect to Evan, right? That in existing nowhere, I mean, one of the things that I describe him as, James Bond is devastatingly handsome. Jack Reacher is 6'5" and a physical specimen. And the line I use to describe Evan in every book is he's just an ordinary guy, not too handsome, right? Average size, average build. And in Evan being nothing in some ways and being the nowhere man, he's able to observe and be more and occupy a different position. People project more onto him. He can lay back and infiltrate situations differently. And there's a sort of force that he has in not putting himself forth as kind of driving ego in some ways. He's very reserved in certain situations. He prefers using minimal force always. And so the nowhere man seemed to kind of go to that. And, again, this is stuff I didn't prefigure. This isn't prefrontal cortex stuff. It's not like I thought all this up when I was writing it. It just seemed like a cool name for an assassin who wasn't easy to find and who left no trace. But the more that I've written into it, and the more I realized that I based him on somebody who's very average in appearance and average of size. And, he doesn't look like much. And that's always is the point. The more I've realized how suited that is to him.
That's really interesting because I always thought it sort of implied he was, like a ghost because he is,
That's right.
I mean, so I thought the nowhere man to some degree pointed up the idea that, he ghosted in for his role and then he ghosted out.
And that's where it started. That's where it started. But I discovered there's more to it than I initially thought.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, there's actually a Beatles connection, of course, with Dark Horse too, because I mean that was George Harrison's record label name, and he had an album called Dark Horse. I don't know if you knew that.
He was the Dark Horse.
Yeah, he was the Dark Horse of the Beatles, and much more obviously spiritually minded than the other guys, and much more interior. So it's kind of an interesting connection there. Okay, there are a couple of Candy McClure questions here. By the same person. Gershon wants to know, will we ever see a standalone novel about Candy McClure?
I don't know what there'll be standalone novels, but I love writing Candy. And she's another one. That's Orphan V, who is, first Evan's nemesis. And then they've evolved into this sort of bizarre partnership. The only parallel I can really think of, I can't really think of one in fiction that comes to mind, but in comics, it's kind of like Batman and Catwoman, Like they're sometimes rivals and they're sometimes allies, and it's always complicated, and it's very sexually charged and very complicated. So I love having her around. Like anytime she's in the and her scenes write themselves, so she'll be around for a while.
Here's a good question. Nancy wants to know, she says, after writing these tense scenes, how do you relax? I almost wrote back vodka. And then she says, or can you? Maybe you just reflect and keep the tension working for you.
Yeah, I mean, bourbon, working out. I like doing physical things after I write that get me back in my body in full in different ways. You know, I'll hike, I'll do yoga, I'll lift, I'll get on the treadmill. You know, wrestling with the dogs. I have 3 Rhodesian Ridgebacks. Ridgebacks make an appearance in the Orphan X books, and where our house is lousy with them. They're everywhere. And so that's a good kind of grounding aspect of it. And then I like watching and reading stuff, but it's interesting for me to relax. It has to be fairly intense. You know, like if I can't sleep, I'll put on Silence of the Lambs and, you know, watch some of that. And then I can go to sleep like a baby. I need something that's really captivating and gripping, and likewise in fiction.
That's disturbing, Greg. We
Yeah.
like it. We like it. A little Hannibal Lecter to put you to sleep. That's awesome. Let's see here. What else do we have? Okay. Yeah, here's a good one. Anna wants to know, when did you first realize you wanted to be an author?
It's such an interesting question. I wanted to be a writer from as early as I can remember. It was so weird. I wasn't allowed to watch television growing up. You know, my parents had read The Plug and Drug. It was the big 60s book about how TV was going to rot your brain. I mean, God knows now, looking forward to smartphones and social media.
Yeah.
And so I went to the library twice a week. You know, I read everything I get my hands on. And I always thought, given how much I loved reading, I thought that actually everybody was like me. You know, there's that narcissism of youth that I thought, and my sister is a great reader. She reads even more than I do. And I remember asking her, well, when do you want to write your first book? I thought that anybody who loved reading would just want to be a writer. And I always thought in stories. I mean, I've illustrated mysteries that I wrote and have crayon illustrations going back to fourth. It's the only thing I ever wanted to do. I was obsessed with it. And it's weird. I never had a question about it. There's never a conscious moment or decision. It was always what I was aimed towards in some ways, which was really good, because it's, you know, anytime that you pick a field that is challenging, it's good to at least know where you're aiming from a young age. And so I'm grateful that I had that.
But you were published at a very young age too. I mean, you've had, you know, we've been together your entire career. Yeah. And you know, you were practically a baby when we started.
I started the Tower when I was 19 years old. I sold it 22 or 23. So I was young.
Very young. And you know, oftentimes the very young are good on form, but not necessarily with enough living experience to be great on substance. But you were always good at that. But you've been lucky in your family. You've got a lot of interesting people in your family who have particular skills that I know have come into play in your books.
Yeah, I mean, I'm from a family of doctors on my dad's side. I think I'm one of the few people who's written a medical thriller who's not a doctor. Some of the reviewers, Do No Harm was my third book.
Right.
And people, I remember some reviewers thought I was a doctor because nobody really, if you think about Tess Gerritsen and Robin Cook and Michael Palmer, who I miss. He was such a wonderful guy. But you know, people who wrote medical thrillers were doctors, but I grew up really steeped in that. And I wrote that, I dedicated that to my father, my third book. And so, yeah, and I'm very rangy in my community and in my friendships. I have a lot of, you know, friends who are Navy SEALs. My second book dealt with a SEALs community, a lot of people in the military. And, you know, I use the books in a lot of ways as an excuse to whatever to me is the most fascinating. I get to go out and research and spend a year and a half of my life just kind of marinating in it. It's a wonderful job that way. I get to just pursue anything that interests me.
Is the fourth X the one with the president in it?
Out of the dark.
It is. So, I mean, in many ways, it's my favorite. Partly it's a fantasy come true. So we won't digress into that. But I felt like you couldn't really have written that book without medical input.
Yes, and a lot of Secret Service input, right? And a lot of knowledge about DC, which I've been spending a lot of time, figuring out some of the inner workings of politics, which some of my pro bono work has taken me in. And I mean, it's one of the wonderful aspects of being a novelist is I get to bring all the parts of myself to it. It's a little chicken or egg as to, whether my interests are driving me being a novelist or the fact that I'm a novelist drives me to pursue anything that's of interest. But it's a wonderful part of it is, I was obsessed with, I got very interested in mind control cults. And so for my fifth book, The Program, which I came out and saw you both for, I went undercover into mind control cults, right? I submitted to cult testing. I did all sorts of meetings. I read about them. I get to kind of go into anything and shine a light into all these dark corners of the world that might be fascinating. And so that's the thing. I've always been driven primarily by curiosity.
One of the things that I have loved about Gregg over all the years we've been together is that he fully inhabits his life. You can't say that about everybody, but you truly do in a really rich and remarkable way. Gregg, it's one of the things I most admire about you. I also should mention, I think Gregg is a very good prose stylist. It's all very well to have action and all the rest of it, but if you don't say it well, for me, it doesn't really cut it. And I do think that Gregg has mastered a very fine style, and that is a big plus. For anybody who is a reader, you should always want the best that you can get from an author in terms of how they narrate the story, not just what the story is. So on that note, Patrick, is there anything else, or would that be a wrap?
That's probably a wrap. I have one last question though, which is, the condo, of course, everybody's always fascinated, and that's one of the most fun parts of the book. Do you have readers, like they bring you vodka? Do they come up with new security gizmos that they thought you might be interested in, or
Like
let
the
you
Rome
in on?
Zone?
Yeah.
I get emails from people. I have a couple, subject matter experts who are good with that I get articles of stuff that's coming 3 to 5 years down the line.
Yeah.
And so I'm constantly playing with that. I mean, one of the cool additions that I've been playing with a lot is the shirts that with a pattern, adversarial pattern to thwart facial recognition. That's really useful. As technology continues to evolve, it's like, how do I keep from Evan going anywhere and just being mapped facially? So I'll read these articles about stuff that's straight out of a DARPA lab or something, and then I'll start to integrate them, sometimes years before they're in wider circulation.
I always thought a pepper spray misting system that you could use by like a Ring product. That would be fun.
For outdoor restaurants too. You could just hit all the Caesar salads all at once.
Right.
Right. Well, you get the
On
full
that
range
note.
of your imagination. You can go from weaponry and defense to construction to assassination to, I do think this series allows you to express yourself fully. And my final question is, and I'm hoping the answer is that you are working on Evan number 8, or it's already done.
I'm working on Evan number 8.
Splendid. Well, we have autographed copies of Dark Horse, and you don't want to miss it. And I want to thank Gregg once again for joining us to launch his wonderful books. It's always a pleasure. It'd be even better if he were here and we were doing this in front of you as a live audience, but I'm looking forward to next year. Meantime, your vodka, my wine. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Good night.
So much.
We'll see you next year in person. Thank you both.
It was a real pleasure.